Good evening, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to St. Ebbe's, and welcome to this special event tonight. And it's wonderful to have you with us, especially if you're here, you're not a regular member of St. Ebbe's, but you're a guest or a visitor who's come along tonight. A really warm welcome to you, and thank you very much for joining us. Just some housekeeping as we begin. If you need the bathroom, it's through the door. The toilets are through the door to my left. And we really hope we don't need to use the fire exits, but if we do, there are the doors to the side and the one at the back. But tonight we're delighted to have Rebecca McLaughlin with us. She's here all of this week for a series of events that the University Christian Union is running. It's wonderful to have her this side of the Atlantic. She's British but lives on the other side, so it's great to have you back here on home soil. Rebecca has authored a number of books. We have them on the bookstall, which you can look at the end of the evening and kind of browse the different titles. And tonight she is speaking. Her title is Jesus Unbelievable? So Rebecca will come in a moment. She'll speak. Then we will have a break for a few minutes to kind of gather our thoughts. And then there will be a Q&A. And if you would like to submit questions for the Q&A, then there's the QR code on the screen above me. Please use your phone to log in and then to submit your question, and then we will try and take as many of them as we can, and we will finish at 9 o'clock. So that's our plan for this evening. But let's give Rebecca a warm welcome as she comes and speaks to us.
The shameful past that I bring with me as I speak to you today. I spent 7 full years at the other place, from which I have, depending on how you look at it, either 3 or 4 different degrees. So I come to you with all my kind of Cambridge pride and lay it down before your Oxford-like contempt. While I was at Cambridge studying for my PhD, I met some really interesting, fascinating, and highly intelligent people from all around the world who'd come to study at Cambridge, because it's actually a really good university. I don't know if you've heard. And one of the most intelligent people I met is a friend of mine who is now a professor of the natural sciences at Harvard. So it's rather fun. We met in the original Cambridge, and we now both live in New Cambridge, and our kids are even at the same school. My friend is so intelligent that he's not just a professor of one particular scientific discipline, he's a professor of the natural sciences. And a few years ago, I took him to an event at Harvard where the agnostic chair of the Harvard philosophy department was in dialogue with a New Testament scholar called N.T. Wright. And the title of the event was The Bible, Gospel, Guide, or Garbage. And after the event, my friend, who was culturally Jewish, but in terms of his beliefs, atheist, I said to him, I know that you think that what I believe is crazy. His then girlfriend, who's a much gentler soul than either of us, said, I'm sure he doesn't think that. I said, yes, he does. I believe that the entirety of human history revolves around a first century Jewish man who died on a cross and was supposedly raised to life 3 days later. Crazy, right? My friend said yes. I don't know where you stand today, or where you sit, I should say, more technically, when it comes to the craziness of the Christian faith. I don't know whether you, like my friend, think that things that people like me, who are serious followers of Jesus, believe are, frankly, insane. But I've been asked tonight to speak on the question, is Jesus unbelievable? And I want to make 4 points before we have some Q&A. The first is that Jesus lived historically. The second is that Jesus died intentionally. The third is that Jesus was raised credibly. And the fourth is that Jesus is worshipped globally. So hopefully, I'm sure I'll raise more questions than I actually answer, and that's what we can address in the Q&A. But I want to sketch out for you some of the reasons why I, as at least moderately educated 21st century Westerner, I know only from the other place, but at least moderately educated, find belief in Jesus to be the most credible option for humanity today. So number one, Jesus lived historically. There's a guy in the US called Bart Ehrman who is very famous for his skepticism when it comes to Christianity. He's actually a professor of New Testament, I believe, at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. But he's written a number of best-selling books where he is critiquing Christianity in general and the Gospels in particular as, truly valid accounts of who Jesus is. But even Bart Ehrman is very clear on the fact that there was a first-century Jewish man known as Jesus of Nazareth. And he points out that even texts outside of the Bible, so outside of the 4 biographies of Jesus in the Bible, the so-called Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there are texts written by people who don't even like Christians that attest to the basic facts of Jesus' historical life. That there was this man who was a first-century Jewish rabbi who was claimed to be the Christ, i.e. the king who God had been promising to send to the Jews for centuries, who was executed by the Romans under the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, and he was subsequently worshipped by his followers as if he were a god. Those are things that you can know about Jesus, even if you don't open the biblical texts at all, as I say, written by people who are quite hostile to Christianity. And Bart Ehrman himself says he's actually kind of tired of people saying, well, we don't even really know whether Jesus existed or whether he was a real historical figure. Actually, we do know, in as much as we know anything historically, that Jesus was a real historical figure. So in that first sense of my first point, Jesus lived historically. At a basic level, I'm saying, yeah, there was this first-century Jewish man about whom these claims were made. But of course, in order to be a Christian, I need to believe so much more about Jesus than that he was just a guy who lived 2,000 years ago and who was executed under Pontius Pilate, and even that he claimed to be the Christ. In fact, as a Christian, I need to have quite a bit of confidence in those 4 New Testament biographies, the so-called Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So why would I have that kind of confidence in these documents that were written so long ago? Now, experts believe that Mark's Gospel was probably the first one to be written down, and there's a reasonable consensus that it was probably written between 35 and 45 years after Jesus' crucifixion. Now, that you can get that, setting aside research done by Christians, you can get that from secular scholars who are researching the Gospels, that they would say that's a reasonable time frame for Mark's Gospel. John's Gospel, almost certainly the last to be written down, experts think was probably written down about 60 years after Jesus' crucifixion. Now, you might say to me, listen, I can't remember what I had for breakfast last Tuesday. Why on earth, or how on earth, could people remember things that happened decades ago, and we should be sort of taking them as so-called gospel truth when there's such a long time gap between when these things happened and when they were written down? Now, I'm not going to ask for a sort of show of hands of people's ages in this room, but the reality is, I personally can't remember things that happened 40 years ago. But there are some people in this room, I guarantee, who actually can remember quite vividly things that happened 40 or even maybe 50 years ago. Not everything, not what they had for breakfast on the Tuesday of, 1961, the 15th of May, but they remember the life-changing events and conversations. All of us, however old we are, as we look back over our lives, there'll be certain things that stand out to us, and we remember the exact words that were said, or the exact song that we heard, or the exact feeling that we had in that situation. Now, Jesus, as you may know, had a group of followers who actually traveled around with him. He had 12 chosen apostles, who are sometimes called the disciples. These are 12 Jewish men who he chose to sort of be symbolically like the 12 tribes of Israel in the Old Testament. And it was these guys' full-time job to travel around with Jesus, just like other disciples with their rabbi, learning his sayings and watching what he did. But Jesus also had a bunch of other followers, including many women, who traveled around with him and listened to what he taught, watched what he did. And after his crucifixion and claimed resurrection, this group of first disciples, the eyewitnesses of Jesus' life and ministry, went around telling everybody they could the stories about Jesus. The 4 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written down precisely so that those eyewitness accounts wouldn't be lost when those eyewitnesses died out. Now, John's Gospel explicitly claims that it was written by an eyewitness, and it's curious because it was the last Gospel to be written down, as I say, probably about 60 years after the events that it records. But it's actually not completely implausible. We could imagine a late teenage or early 20s disciple of Jesus, who then in his 80s is, after decades of telling these stories and reflecting on his time with Jesus, is then writing down his testimony for us. And the four Gospels are presenting themselves to us as eyewitness testimony. There's a fascinating British scholar called Richard Borkham, who wrote this stunning book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, where he points out that if you look at the way that history was written in the ancient world, what you'll find is that when people name somebody in the narrative, they're actually pointing to them specifically as an eyewitness. So if you sit down and read any of the Gospels, you'll notice there are a lot of people who are anonymous, and then you'll notice some people who are given names, and you're thinking, oh, it's cute, I wonder why that particular blind man was identified as a man called Bartimaeus, rather than just, a blind man Jesus healed. Well, Richard Borkham argues that that's the Gospel authors citing their sources. I know we've got some postgrads here. You spend a lot of time citing your sources. That's what the Gospel authors are doing. So I could go on and on about, I'll answer more questions in the Q&A. But we have actually good evidence to think that the four Gospels that are in our Bibles today, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are giving us reliable access to eyewitness testimony about Jesus of Nazareth. So what do these Gospels claim about this first century Jewish man? Now, my guess is that there would be many people in this city today, and perhaps people in this room today, who would say, do you know what? I believe that Jesus was a great teacher. His ethical teachings have had a real impact on human history since. But some of the claims that Christians make about him, they've really got to have been exaggerated over time. I can understand that objection. But if we sit down and read through any of these gospel accounts, we'll find that actually Jesus' ethical teachings and what he says about himself are impossible to pull apart. And often, actually, Jesus is grounding his ethical teachings in his claims about who he is. For example, time and again in the Gospels, to an almost embarrassing extent, Jesus has to explain to his disciples that the way things work in his kingdom is actually the reverse of the way things work in the world. He says, in the world, outside of Jesus' kingdom, people claw their way up to the top of the pile, and then they get to kick down to those at the bottom. But Jesus says, no, in my kingdom, it works the other way around. If anybody wants to be great in Jesus' kingdom, he must be the least. In fact, he must be the slave of all. Why is that? Jesus says, because even the Son of Man, referring to himself, did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. What is Jesus talking about there? It's one of many times in the Gospels when Jesus is actually positioning himself as a slave who intentionally came to die the death most associated with slaves in the ancient world. Crucifixion was sort of designed as to maximize torture and humiliation and was mostly inflicted on slaves. But Jesus, in the Gospels, kept telling his disciples that he was going to die this brutal and humiliating death, and that he was dying intentionally. Why? To give his life as a ransom for many. Again, we need to think about the sort of language of slavery there. You could ransom a slave or a prisoner of war by paying a certain amount for their life. And Jesus is saying that the whole purpose of his coming to earth was actually to die that death to be a ransom for many. Now, his disciples could not get their head around this. In fact, when Jesus first explained this to his disciples, one of his closest followers, Peter, took him aside and said, no, that cannot be the plan. He couldn't believe that Jesus, who was God's chosen king, was going to die this shameful and humiliating death. That would look like utter failure. But in fact, it was Jesus' plan all along. And it wasn't just his plan to die. It was his plan to die in the place of human beings like you and me, who have turned our backs on God, who are facing God's judgment and God's punishment for our sin, to die in our place and then to be raised to new life. That brings us to our third point, which is that Jesus was raised credibly. Many people today would think, okay, of course those first century uneducated, unscientific, illiterate people were gullible enough to believe that a man rose from the dead, like physically rose from the dead, we're talking here, not like a metaphorical resurrection, but like a guy who was actually dead, walking out of his grave three days later. But you can't expect me, as an educated, sort of scientifically literate person today, to believe in miracles like that. And I'd want to say, actually, yes, I can. And one of the reasons I can expect you to at least be open to the possibility of that miracle is that some of the leading scientists in all the world also believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. And they don't think that their scientific education excludes that possibility. The latest book that I read is called Is Easter Unbelievable? I think we've got some copies here. In it, one of the stories I'm telling is of an MIT professor called Ian Hutchinson, who lives down the street from where I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. MIT is sort of like the high temple of science in America. And Ian is also a fellow Brit. I'm afraid he's also a fellow person from the other place. He became a Christian when he was an undergraduate at Cambridge University, was baptized on his 21st birthday, and has gone on to be a senior professor at MIT. And he explains that the methods of science are designed to help us to study the repeatable patterns that we see in the natural world. They're specifically not designed to tell us if a miracle happened or not, because by definition, a miracle is an unusual event. When Christians say we believe that Jesus rose from the dead, it's not because we think typically people rise from the dead, and therefore you'd be able to study that with the methods of science. No, we're saying that actually the God who made the universe and sustains it to this day, the God who upholds all the laws of the universe to this day, that at that moment in history, he did something very unique and different in returning life to this person who had died. Now we can look at the historical evidence for the resurrection and how there actually seems to be sort of credible historical evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. At the end of the day, we can't prove it one way or another. Frankly, we can't prove any historical event one way or another. All we're ever going to be doing is sort of looking at evidence that will point us in one direction or another. But I think we need to open ourselves to the possibility that this man who claimed he was in fact the Son of God, who had come to earth to die for us, was also then raised to life. I think we need to open ourselves to that being at least a possibility. And I think, for me, honestly, the best evidence for this possibility being an actuality is my fourth point, which is that today, 2,000 years later, Jesus is worshipped globally. When you think about it, indeed, when you think about it, the claims that were first made about Jesus 2,000 years ago seemed utterly ridiculous. Here's this man who never wrote a book or sat on a throne or led an army, claiming that he's the rightful king, not just of the Jews, but of the whole world. Completely absurd. It was especially absurd from a Jewish perspective, because this man Jesus had claimed he was the Son of God. And unlike the Greeks and Romans around them, the Jews were fiercely monotheistic. They believed in a God who was utterly transcendent, completely unlike us humans. The idea that God himself could have taken on human flesh would have been blasphemous and absurd from a Jewish perspective. But it was also ridiculous from a Greek and Roman perspective for different reasons. You see, the Greeks and Romans, they were kind of used to the idea that humans could be recognized as divine, or at least sort of demigods. In fact, they'd often call their great emperors Son of God, and they'd worship their emperors, perhaps after they died, as divine. That the problem for them would not have been that this man was claimed to be the Son of God. The problem for them was that this was a man who was an utter failure. A man who had been literally sort of crushed under the boot of Rome, who had died the most shameful and humiliating death, a death that Romans wouldn't even talk about in polite society because it was so offensive and humiliating. The claim that this crucified man was the rightful king of all the world seemed absolutely absurd. But today, if we were to survey every human being who is alive today and to ask them, who is the rightful king of all the world? The most frequent answer that we would get is Jesus Christ. Today, 2,000 years after this man died on a Roman cross, he is worshipped not just by one demographic in one area of the world, but actually the message of Jesus has spawned the most popular global belief system. About 31% of the world today identifies as Christian, and that proportion is actually set to increase rather than to decrease in the coming years. Experts think that by 2060 it'll be about 32%. Of course, global population is growing, so it's the overall number of Christians is growing, but proportionally increasing from about 31% to 32%. Conversely, the proportion of people who identify as not religious of any kind, including atheists, agnostics, and nuns, is set to decrease from about 15% to about 13% in the next 40 years. You know, the idea that Jesus is in fact the rightful king of all the universe, the Son of God, the Savior of the world, this is not an idea that was once upon a time credible but is receding as history goes on. This is actually an idea that has taken root across the globe, and that it is spreading today, even and especially in places that have historically been very opposed to Christianity. And one of the most extraordinary things that's happening in the world today is the growth of the church in China, which is, until recently, and currently the global center of atheism. But the church in China is growing so fast that experts think there'll be more Christians in China than in America in the next few years. And there's at least one leading sociologist of religion in China who thinks that China could be a majority Christian country by 2060. So Jesus is worshipped globally. He's worshipped by people, as the last book of the Bible, Revelation, puts it, from every tribe and tongue and nation. He's worshipped by people in Africa and in Asia and in Europe and in America. He's worshipped not just by the rich, but also by the very poor. Not mostly by men, but actually mostly, and this has always been the case, by women, curiously enough. Jesus has always been profoundly attractive to women. Jesus started a moral revolution that we're still feeling the effects of 2,000 years later, which we can talk more about in the Q&A. Belief in Jesus sparked the scientific revolution, which I was talking about earlier on over lunch with some of the Oxford students. And so is Jesus unbelievable today? I would say in one sense, yes. Because his offer of personal love for each of us is quite unbelievable, utterly extraordinary. But I don't think it requires us to leave our intellect or our rationality behind in order for us to accept that.
Rebecca, thank you very much indeed. Lots of food for thought there. Let's take a moment. We will have a break now for a couple of moments, and then there will be a chance for Q&A. You'll see the QR code and the Slido code on the screen. So please use that to submit your questions, and then we'll try and get through as many as we can by 9 o'clock. Okay, everyone, let's thank you very much for questions. So let's try and get through as many as we can. Rebecca, first one here. You mentioned that Christianity has spread globally. Why would this not be because of colonialism and imperialism and enforcement through conquest?
Yeah, really good question. Yeah, and I think there's a common perception that Christianity really sort of started off as a white Western religion and then was exported globally through colonialism, right? I mean, that's often kind of how the story is told, and I would say that is largely actually untrue. I'm not saying there's no truth in it, and we'll come to that in a second, but I would say it was largely untrue. So number one, from the first, Christianity started in the Middle East, And it became multicultural, multiracial, and multi-ethnic from the very beginning. For instance, we meet the first African Christian in the book of Acts in the New Testament, in Acts chapter 8, when a highly educated African man is reading from the scroll of Isaiah, and the Holy Spirit of God sends an apostle to come and explain to him what's happening in this passage that he's reading. Now, we don't know, this guy is from Ethiopia, or a land that was at that time called, identified with Ethiopia. We don't know what exactly happened to him when he went back home, but we do know that Ethiopia became one of the first officially Christian states in the world, centuries before St. Patrick went to Ireland and the gospel went to North America, for instance. We see the church in India, for instance, being extraordinarily old, dating back to probably the 2nd century. We see the sort of spread of the gospel in places like Iran and Iraq, which today would be more associated with Islam, actually specifically through a history of conquest, that originally were very early sort of seeds of the church sown there. So we've seen Christianity from the beginning being if anything, a Middle Eastern religion that then goes global actually very quickly. Now, certainly there are missionary movements that also came along with colonialism, and I think some of that was well-meaning, and I think some of it was exporting Western culture, which honestly has nothing to do with Christianity, along with the gospel in ways that I think are profoundly unhelpful, and that we're probably feeling the effects of today. But to identify Christianity with sort of white Western culture is, I think, a profound misunderstanding both of the history of the church and of the reality of the global church today.
Great, thank you. Related to that, how can you square the existence of Jesus with the other gods worshipped in other religions?
So I think what I'm going to understand from that question, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, if you're the questioner, is not the existence of Jesus as a historical figure, but probably how can I say, Jesus is the one human being who is uniquely revealing God to us, when in fact there are other religious traditions that are pointing to other deities. Is that, maybe the person who asked that question could just clarify if that's what they're getting at? Or else I'll just assume that it is and go from there. Yeah, so there's one way of thinking which says, honestly, there are so many different competing religions and belief systems out there. How can you possibly say that Christianity is actually true, and that, for example, Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism is incorrect in their claims about truth? And in fact, isn't that a really arrogant thing to say? To say, well, I have the truth, and the millions of Muslims around the world are actually mistaken in their beliefs. I think that can be said arrogantly, and frankly, all of us, certainly myself, have a tendency towards pride, where I'm quite capable of thinking well of myself compared to other people, and I'm quite capable of sort of being, proud of the fact that I think I know the truth and trying to use that to lord it over other people. That's certainly something I'm capable of. But I don't think that has to be the case. I think actually we most respect people who hold different religious beliefs by taking those differences very seriously. If I sit down with a Muslim friend, I can say, I would love to understand more of what you believe as a Muslim. I'm not going to say that I think my belief as a Christian is the same as your belief as a Muslim, because they're not. They're actually making incompatible claims about truth in general and about Jesus in particular. And if we even just boil down to the three great sort of monotheistic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, they make fundamentally different historical claims about what happened to Jesus that can't all be true. Christians say that Jesus physically died on the cross and was physically raised to life 3 days or on the third day after that. Muslims say that Jesus actually didn't die on the cross, that it just seemed like he did. And Jews and Hindus and Buddhists and atheists, for that matter, think that Jesus died and was not raised again. Now, either Jesus rose from the dead or he didn't. And that's a question of sort of historical truth. It's an objective truth question. And as a Christian, if I am incorrect and Jesus was not raised from the dead, then he's not who he claimed to be. He's not truly the Son of God. And maybe one of the other religions is actually correct in all their other truth claims. But I don't think the fact that there are multiple competing truth claims means that we cannot say that there is one that is true and the others are false. In fact, I would expect my Muslim friends and my Jewish friends and my Hindu friends to make the exact same claim themselves, say, actually, I think that my religious beliefs are correct and yours, I'm sorry to say, are incorrect.
I'm going to ask, there are 3 questions here around faith, so we'll sort of take them one by one. There are people who saw Jesus' miracles and yet did not believe.
Yep.
What makes some people believe and some don't?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Jesus famously, once said that if somebody didn't believe the Old Testament scriptures, then even if they saw somebody raised from the dead, they still wouldn't believe. So it seems that our belief or otherwise isn't just a question of the evidence that we have in front of us, that there's something sort of deeper going on there. And one of the really curious and in some ways offensive things that the Bible says is that actually none of us in and of ourselves, none of us are capable of living in a way that fundamentally pleases God. And actually none of us are capable in and of ourselves of recognizing Jesus for who he is and putting our trust in him. That actually we need to have, sort of have our eyes opened to who Jesus is. And that this is not something that we can sort of generate in and of ourselves, but that it's something that is more like a gift given to us by God. And that can be really troubling in one sense, because I think all of us would like to think, oh well, no, we're absolutely autonomous agents. We make our own decisions. We look at the evidence. We assess all our beliefs on the basis of evidence. There's quite strong psychological evidence to suggest we don't. We actually mostly go with our gut instincts and our feelings and emotions rather than with our rationality, much as we think of ourselves as being so very rational. So why is it that some people believe and others don't? I think that it's because God is enabling some people to believe when none of us could in and of ourselves. Just like, and this is the language that the New Testament sometimes uses, before we repent and believe in Jesus, it's actually that we're spiritually dead. And dead people can't do anything. I mean, actually, a dead person in and of themselves can't get up and start making their own decisions. And we need Jesus to call us into life.
It's a bit more personally. What if anything would convince you that your beliefs were wrong? For example, if intelligent life was found on another planet, how would that affect your faith?
Yeah, intelligent life on another planet actually wouldn't bother me at all. I don't think there is intelligent life on other planets. I think it's unlikely, despite the fact there are so many other planets. But I don't think it would actually be much different from, say there was an island that we hadn't discovered in the world somewhere, and there were people living on the island, and we say, another island with people living on it that we didn't know about. I don't think it would cause me to have any sort of fundamental sort of faith questions that God had maybe sort of made other beings in other places. What would cause me to lose my faith in Jesus is, it's a really good question, because I am so used at this point in my life to putting all my chips on the square of faith in Jesus, that it would take a whole lot to disrupt that. And my guess is that's probably true of all of us, whatever our current convictions are, that there's probably a lot that's hanging on that for us. Maybe you're not a Christian, and actually a lot is hanging on your disbelief in God right now. Or perhaps a lot is hanging on your convictions and your other religious beliefs. So I think for all of us, if we're honest, it would take a lot to really change our beliefs. So what would that be for me? In all honesty, I don't actually know. I'm not saying that nothing could. I just don't know what it would be that would cause me to stop trusting in Jesus.
And have you ever doubted your faith in Jesus?
Do you know, because I think because I have always been a Christian in environments where most people weren't. Unlike, for example, my husband comes from Oklahoma in the US, which is part of the sort of Bible Belt, and grew up in a Christian family where almost all his friends at school at least identified as Christian. Most of them went to church, whether or not they really believed anything, who knows, but it was like very much normal to be a Christian. I grew up in a more of a social context where it was really abnormal to be a Christian, and so I was sort of under pressure from friends who were not Christians from the word go. And I think actually for that reason, oddly, I haven't been through a period of massively questioning my faith, because I feel like I sort of had to ask the questions all the way up. Does that make any sense? People sometimes ask me, because I read quite a lot of books by atheist, agnostic, and other sort of authors, try to kind of stay abreast with some of the more popular kind of public intellectuals and various pressures. And people sometimes ask, doesn't that challenge your faith? I actually find the opposite. The more I read of atheist and agnostic authors, the more convinced I become that Jesus is actually the most satisfying answer. I think, thinking back to that conversation with my friend who I took to the event at Harvard, often we think that we're comparing Christianity with all its crazy beliefs in people rising from the dead to a sort of perfectly coherent secular worldview that does all the work that Christianity does, but without having to believe crazy stuff. And I actually don't think there is that kind of alternative. I think it's hard not to sink into utter despair and meaninglessness if there is no God and if Jesus isn't who he says he is.
You spoke about how Christianity is popular with women, and how women, certainly in the New Testament, were attracted to Jesus. Is Christianity a patriarchal religion? If so, is it compatible with feminism?
It depends how you define patriarchal, it depends how you define feminism. Let's talk about feminism, because the fundamental idea that men and women are equal in value and dignity is something which most people, pretty much everybody actually in our society today, would see as a self-evident truth. Not a truth that needs any kind of religious grounding, but just like basic moral common sense. Just like our belief that people of all different racial backgrounds are equal in value, just like our belief that the strong and the rich and the powerful don't have the right to trample on the poor and the weak and the marginalized. That there are certain sort of set of beliefs like that seem like basic moral common sense to us, whether we identify as Christian or atheist or agnostic or Hindu. In Western culture, we have this shared set of beliefs. But it turns out that they are fundamentally Christian beliefs, and if you look at the history of thought, they've come to us from Christianity. So especially this idea that men and women are fundamentally equal, that was not a self-evident truth in the ancient world into which Christianity was born. It was very obvious in that world that men were superior to women. And the idea that women should be equally valued and given equal sort of protection and dignity to men, that would have seemed really, really weird. But the Bible from the very first says that men and women are equally made in the image of God. That what is unique and precious about us as humans is something that both men and women exemplify. And Jesus, in his treatment of women, his relationships with women, the way that he welcomed women as his disciples in every sense, the way that he protected women when they were under attack from men, the way that he welcomed even women who were sort of been especially morally outcasts in his time and place, actually changed the trajectory of how women were then perceived subsequently. And so when we think today about feminism, which at its base is saying actually women should be treated with equal value and dignity to men, that's actually a profoundly Christian belief. Now, there are certain beliefs that have been tied up with feminism today that I think are profoundly anti-Christian. In particular, a lot of people who would identify as feminists today would say that it is a basic right and a basic, like, almost the linchpin of feminism is the right to have an abortion. I actually think that the linchpin, the like fundamental basis for women's equality is not the right to have an abortion. I think it's the cross of Jesus. When the most powerful man who ever lived died the most brutal death ever died in order to protect his people. And when it comes to the question of abortion, and I know this is a very painful and personal and a sort of emotional question, probably for all of us in different ways. I guess what I want to say is, if there is no God, and if Jesus isn't who he says he is, and if he didn't die for your sin and for mine on the cross, then the unborn baby in the mother's womb is just a collection of atoms and molecules. But if there is no God, and if Jesus isn't who he says he is, and if he didn't die on the cross for your sin and for mine, that's just what I am as well. And that's just what you are. So when we think about feminism, I think we need to think sort of more deeply theologically and to understand the foundations for human equality between men and women, and actually between humans with all our various differences, that is actually grounded on this idea that we're made in the image of God and that we're equally precious to God, that all of us were worth the death of his beloved Son.
Thank you. Can you be a Christian and LGBTQ+?
Again, I'd want to say it depends. I didn't have time to tell you my entire life history. Thankfully, I still don't have time to tell you my entire life history. It'd be really be here all night. But if I were not a Christian, I would almost certainly be married to a woman rather than to a man. I've been a Christian pretty much for as long as I can remember. I've been attracted to other women as long as I can remember as well. I've been happily married to a man for the last 15 years. But I sometimes joke to my husband, at least he knows I'll never leave him for another man. And I actually have many of my close friends, for one reason or like I haven't orchestrated this, but the reality is many of my close friends are also people who, were they not Christians, would likely be married to somebody of their same sex. For each of these close friends, it has been very clear to them, as it's very clear to me, that actually when we put our trust in Jesus, we surrender everything to him, including our sexuality. And the Bible is actually painfully clear that same-sex sexual relationships are actually not the off-limits for Christians. And that they would be in the category of sort of ongoing unrepentant sexual sin, which the Bible says puts us outside of the kingdom of God. Now, I know that sounds like really kind of countercultural and harsh and sort of offensive. The reality is the Bible is offensive from beginning to end. But what I've realized as I've studied the Bible more and more on these questions is that this is not just because God has sort of arbitrary rules that he felt like imposing on people for no particular reason, but actually because the whole purpose of Christian marriage and the reason why God made us sort of male and female in the first place and gave us the capacity to get married and to create babies in the way that we do was in order to tell us something about his love for us. So one of the curious things that Jesus says in the Gospels is he says that he is the bridegroom. And you think, well, that's an odd thing to say for a man who never got married in the course of his life. But actually, he's tapping into this Old Testament theme where God is presented as a sort of loving, faithful husband and Israel is this all too often unfaithful wife. Jesus comes along and says he's the bridegroom. And then in the New Testament, we see Paul in his letter to the Ephesians explaining that Christian marriage is like a little scale model of Jesus' love for his church. And we see in the book of Revelation at the end of the Bible, this great shout goes up, the wedding of the Lamb has come, talking about Jesus, and we see Jesus' marriage to his church bringing heaven and earth back together. This is actually why marriage is male-female for Christians and why husbands and wives are called to different roles. Like Christ in the church, it's a love built on sacrifice. Like Christ in the church, it's a flesh-uniting, never-ending, exclusive love. And it's a love across difference, which is pictured for us in the difference of male and female in marriage. So we need to understand that Christian sexual ethics, I sometimes like to say, it's even weirder than you might think. It's actually all pointing back to this story, this picture, this metaphor, helping us to understand Jesus' love for us. But the other really important thing to understand, and I'm almost finished, so don't panic, I'm not going through my whole life history here. The other thing we need to understand is that marriage is not the only relationship that is meant to point us to Jesus' love. And the night that Jesus was betrayed to his death, he said to his disciples, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you." And then he says this, "Greater love has no one than this, than that he laid down his life for his friends." Now we, in our culture and our world today, we have collapsed all real love and intimacy down into sexual and romantic love. And we've lived and thought as if that is actually the place where all real intimacy happens. Sexual and romantic love, and maybe parent-child love. We have completely lost the vision for the kind of love that we might experience in friendship that Jesus is talking about there, and which he says, actually, there is no greater love than the love that he was going to show in laying down his life for his friends. So just as marriage gives us a tiny little echo of Jesus' love for us, so we should experience that kind of love and friendship. And as the further I go on in the Christian life, the more I kind of get my hands around the reality that all the different kinds of love relationships I experience in my life, so the love that I experience in marriage, the love that I experience with my children, and the love that I experience with my friends, are at their very best giving me tiny little echoes of God's love for me.
Thank you. What is the historical evidence for the resurrection? Just another small topic.
Yeah, I mean, fair enough. If you're tired of listening to me and you feel like reading my little book is Easter Unbelievable instead, I go into some of that there. So it's essentially looking at the various other possibilities. So Jesus was publicly executed by the Romans, definitely the most prominent sort of high-profile crucifixion that day. And like I said, crucifixion was actually a relatively common way in which the Romans got rid of people. So Jesus wasn't unique in being crucified, but he was definitely like a high-profile crucifixion. And if Roman soldiers knew anything, they knew how to kill. So some people will say, well, Jesus wasn't raised from the dead. He just didn't really die on the cross. And then he was sort of bundled into his tomb and probably like staggered out a few days later and said to his disciples, "Hi guys, I'm back." Maybe, like possibly, it's definitely a little implausible given how good the Romans were at doing people in. They would definitely have lost their jobs for failing in the act of crucifying Jesus. And then you can say, well, maybe Jesus died and was properly dead, and then his disciples had this great idea, if we claim that Jesus rose from the dead, then we can sort of carry on the movement without him. Again, possible, but there are a few problems with that hypothesis as well. So one of which is that many of the first disciples who were going around proclaiming the resurrection actually ended up being executed. So if they were saying something that they knew actually wasn't true, it's rather odd that they wouldn't have kind of recanted that before they were killed for the faith that they were proclaiming. It's also not the case. I mean, it was not unheard of for people to claim to be the Messiah, the Christ, the sort of long-promised king sent by God, for things to end in disaster, like crucifixion in particular. But what typically happened then was that the followers would say, okay, yeah, they'd either disband and sort of go back home and pretend it never happened, or they would find somebody else to be the figurehead. Now, a couple of obvious candidates with the Christian movement would have been Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples, or maybe James, who was Jesus' biological half-brother, at least, who went on to be a significant leader in the early church. But it seems like nobody tried that approach, because actually the idea that somebody would have been raised from the dead was like pretty much outside of the Jewish way of thinking at that time. They believed that there would be a resurrection on the last day, like at the end of the world when God would come to judge, a resurrection of the faithful. But the idea that somebody, like right then and there, would have been raised from the dead, and that they could proclaim that this person was king would have been like way outside their framework of thinking. Now, none of that, I mean, like I say, none of that is to say, well, this proves that Jesus was in fact raised from the dead. I personally, as I said, I think that some of the most compelling evidence for it is the fact that this sort of dispirited, cowardly little handful of a few dozen disciples suddenly turned into a preaching team that changed the world to the extent that today it's the most popular global belief system. That at least sort of makes you wonder, well, I wonder what happened to start that off. And I think the resurrection of Jesus offers a very good explanation for that.
A couple of questions about the Bible. Who and what actually decided what got written in the NIV Bible we are currently reading?
In the NIV Bible in particular?
It says, well, maybe just go for the Bible then, without getting into the NIV too much.
Yeah, I mean, the NIV is like one translation, one decently good translation among many English translations. I, once upon a time, went to theological college and learned Greek, which the New Testament Greek that the New Testament's written in. I'm very rusty on it now, so don't be impressed with my Greek skills at all. But if you are interested to learn more, you can stop relying on the NIV or the ESV or any other English translation, and you can do the work of learning New Testament Greek or the Hebrew of the Old Testament and read it in the original for yourselves. I think maybe the sort of question under this question is, well, who decided which books got to be in the Bible and which didn't? Is that fair to say? So in terms of the Old Testament, most of those decisions were already made before Jesus' birth, in that it was the scriptures of the Jewish people who claimed to be God's people for centuries, and they were preserving the texts of their history and their prophets, which as a Christian today I would say is part of how God is revealing himself to us, still through those Old Testament scriptures. So at the most simple level, the Jews decided what went into the Old Testament. There's a couple of questions around the edges there on some sort of marginal texts that may or may not be included, but that's basically where we are. When it comes to the New Testament text, and I think particularly to the gospel texts, which is what all of this really stands or falls on when we're talking about Jesus, the four gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written extremely early on. Compared to any other, there are some other texts that are claimed to be gospels, or sort of today referred to as gospels. For example, the Gospel of Thomas, which are sometimes in the headlines as there are all these other gospels that kind of got excluded from the Bible when they were actually equally or even more authentic versions of the history about Jesus. What I would encourage you to do, if you think that, is to actually sit down and read one of these other gospels. They're very weird documents, actually. They're really unlike the New Testament Gospels, and they're not actually giving us a biography of Jesus in the same way. They're usually collections of sort of esoteric sayings of Jesus from supposedly from after he was raised from the dead. They're typically written substantially later and by people who there's far less evidence to sort of see them as connected to the actual eyewitness testimony about Jesus. People sometimes think that the canon, or the kind of accepted group of writings in the New Testament and the Gospels, was not established until the Council of Nicaea, centuries after these things happened. Actually, that's not true. The four Gospels were circulated very widely and very quickly after they were written, and were recognized by the church as the sort of authentic accounts of Jesus, pretty much from the word go. There really weren't impressive competitors to them.
We're running out of time, so we'll have a few questions just to finish. Where does that 31% of global population being Christian stat come from?
Great question. Yeah, if you want to Google, there's a thing called the Pew Forum Research, which looks at all sorts of different kind of phenomena and statistics from around the world. They published a massive study on global religious futures. I think it was originally published in 2015, though there's been some data that they've added to it since. The sociologist of religion in China I quoted was a guy called Fanggang Yang, who's a professor at Purdue University. He's the one who thinks that if current rates of growth continue, that China could be a majority Christian country by 2060. And that actually may mean that more of the world proportionally is Christian if that comes about as well. Great.
How does a convert know they did not pick Christianity out of all religions simply because it fits their existing belief systems?
Yeah, I mean, there's one sense in which Christianity can feel like a good fit for our existing belief systems if we were raised in a culture where, for example, human beings are seen as fundamentally morally equal, where the poor are meant to be cared for and not trampled on, where diversity is seen as a positive value, etc., etc. There's one sense in which we might sort of recognize Christianity in that, because it's come to us from Christianity originally, whether or not we realize it. There's another sense in which I think if you truly put your trust in Jesus, you will find it to be a profoundly disruptive thing to do. Because you will realize that suddenly you're not in charge of your own life anymore. There is actually, one of the things that happens when you put your trust in Jesus is that you recognize him as your Lord. And that means he has absolute rights over every area of your life. It means that suddenly your money doesn't belong to you anymore. Your sexuality doesn't belong to you anymore. Your family doesn't belong to you anymore. Your friends don't belong to you. Your work, nothing really belongs to you anymore. It all belongs to Jesus. Now, Jesus' hands are the safest place for anything that we thought might belong to us. And if Jesus is who he claims to be, then he loves us so much that he literally died for us. So this shouldn't be a terrifying reality in the sense of, oh my goodness, somebody who doesn't have my best interests at heart is suddenly kind of taking over my life. But it should feel like a whole life takeover. And as you go on in the Christian faith, if you have put your trust in Jesus, what you will likely experience is not that as you go on you get more and more sort of impressed with yourself and more kind of pleased, like, oh, look at me, I'm becoming more and more holy by the day, fantastic. Probably what you'll experience is recognizing more and more the ways in which you are, as the Bible puts it, sinful. And recognizing that things which you didn't even notice about yourself, like assumptions and ways that you've operated for years that you hadn't even ever questioned, suddenly come into question under the spotlight of Jesus' sort of role in your life. It is absolutely an extraordinary, adventurous and beautiful way to live, but it is not a safe and comfortable way to live. So if you want a safe and comfortable life, don't even think about putting your trust in Jesus.
You clearly think Jesus is believable. This is the final question. Say I now agree with you, what would be my next step in the process of exploring him further?
One of the funny things about Christianity is that it's not a solo sport. If you put your trust in Jesus, you become part of a family. In fact, the Bible puts it even more strongly. It says that you become part of his body here on earth, which is all believers together at Jesus' body. It's very strange. But if that is what's happened to you, then the first thing that I would recommend that you do is go and tell another Christian. Now, I met with a woman earlier today who'd come to visit me from London just because she had read one of the books and wanted to chat about some stuff. And she told me her testimony had come to Jesus, which, if we've got like 2 minutes, can I 2 minutes? So she said she was in drama school, absolutely, acting was her ambition. She was very excited to get to drama school, then very disappointed by the fact that it wasn't really living up to her expectations. But on the plus side, she was dating this girl who she really loved, and she was, very much hoping that they would get married in the end, and, all things were good on that front. But then a few things happened. She broke up with this girl. One of the only people she knew who was actually a Christian died very, very young. This guy died in his early 20s. And she called his mum to say, I'm really sorry about your son dying. And his mum said to her, he had so much peace when he was dying in the hospital. He said to me, Mum, I'm seeing Jesus, and it's so beautiful. I wish you could come with me now. And she said to this girl, if you want to do anything to honor his memory, then go and find out more about Jesus for yourself. And so she did. She went and found out more about Jesus. she prayed that Jesus would give her joy, and suddenly Jesus did give her joy. And she thought, oh my goodness, I think maybe I'm becoming a Christian. And then the next day, she walked into, she was no longer in drama school, she was doing dance class now. She walked into a dance class, and this girl came up to her and she said, God has told me to come and talk to you. Would you like to come to church with me on Sunday? And she was like, yes, I became a Christian yesterday. I'm no Christian, I don't know what I'm doing here. But yes, and she said this girl had never done that before. This other Christian who'd come up to her had never had this experience before of God saying, go and talk to that girl now, invite her to church. So it may be that another Christian will find you first, because God's sometimes sort of sneaky like that. But yeah, if you have put your trust in Jesus, or if you do, go and find another brother or sister fast and see if they can help you.
Great, thank you very much. If you would like to find out more, we here at St Ebbe's are running a course called Christianity Explored.
That's what I should have said.
That's fine. I'll set the details. The details are on the screen. We begin again, a course next Tuesday evening. Come along here for some food, and it's a chance to ask questions and have questions answered about the Christian faith. There's a video. You'll be part of a group, and you can say as much or as little as you want. And we would love to be able to talk to you more about the Jesus, about the difference he can make in your life. About who he is and what it means to follow him. So that's Christianity Explored starting next Tuesday. Rebecca, thank you so much for being with us tonight and for sharing with us some of your story as well as answering these different questions. Let's give Rebecca a round of applause. And thank you very much to you for coming and for making this a really enjoyable evening. Rebecca will be around, so if you would like to grab hold of her. There are her books on the bookstall at the back, so please do browse and buy. They are excellent. I can personally recommend them to you, having read some of them myself and found them very, very helpful. So they're there. Rebecca is still around. And enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you for coming.